"You are nothing but a freeloader, Natalie, living in our house like you own the place," Susan's voice screeched through the speaker, layered over the sounds of wind and distant laughter. She was calling from a luxury suite on a cruise ship in the Mediterranean. I was standing in the silent, empty foyer of the Victorian estate my mother had left solely to me. I didn't scream back. I didn't cry. I simply tapped the red button to end the call. The silence returned instantly. I walked to the heavy oak front door and turned the deadbolt. Click. They were never coming back inside. Before we get into the revenge, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. To understand why I locked the door, you have to understand the house. My mother called it the Painted Lady. It wasn't just a Victorian estate. It was a living, breathing piece of art that sat on 3 acres of emerald green lawn. It smelled of lemon oil, old cedar, and the lavender my mother dried in the sunroom. Every spindle on the staircase, every pane of stained glass in the foyer she had restored with her own hands. When she passed, she didn't just leave me a property. She left me her soul. She left me a legacy wrapped in gingerbread trim and slate shingles, and for 2 years I had let parasites infest it. It started with a plea. My father Brian had sat me down in the kitchen not long after the funeral. He looked gray and defeated. He told me his new business venture had collapsed. He told me he and his new wife Susan were drowning in rent they couldn't afford. Just for 6 months, Nat, he had begged, his eyes wet. Just until we get back on our feet. We won't get in your way. We'll be like ghosts. I was 22, grieving and desperate to hold on to the only family I had left. So I said yes. I opened the door. 6 months turned into a year turned into 2. The ghosts became very loud and very permanent. Susan brought with her a cloud of cloying synthetic perfume that masked the scent of my mother's lavender. She brought furniture that looked like it belonged in a sterile dentist's waiting room, sharp angles and beige fabric that clashed violently with the warm mahogany of the parlor. But the furniture wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the lie. I didn't realize it at first. I was busy with my landscape architecture firm, often leaving before they woke up and coming home after they'd eaten dinner. But the comments started slipping out. Susan would walk through the hallway, trailing a hand along the wainscoting, and say things like, "When we finally remodel this drafty old junk, we're going to open this whole wall up." Or she'd snap at me if I left a design blueprint on the dining table. "Natalie, please keep your work in the servants' quarters. We have guests coming." Servants' quarters. She meant the small guest suite I had moved into so they could have the master bedroom. I confronted my father about it late one night. He looked terrified. "I couldn't tell her the truth, Nat," he whispered, glancing at the ceiling as if she could hear us through the floorboards. "If she knew the house was yours, she'd feel like a guest. I told her I bought it from your mother's estate. I told her you're just helping out, acting as the caretaker until you find your own place." I stared at him. He had erased my ownership to buy his wife's comfort. He had reduced me to a squatter in my own inheritance. "You have to tell her," I said. "I will," he promised. "I just need the right moment." That moment never came. Instead, I became the live-in maid. I fixed the plumbing when it leaked. I pruned the roses. I paid the property taxes. And in return, Susan treated me like an employee she couldn't wait to fire. She looked at my mother's legacy and saw a teardown. She looked at me and saw an obstacle. And I, paralyzed by the fear of losing my father, completely let it happen. I let them play house in my sanctuary, convincing myself that keeping the peace was worth the price of my dignity. People ask me why I didn't throw them out sooner. They ask how a grown woman, a professional landscape architect who manages million-dollar commercial projects, could let herself be reduced to a guest in her own home. The answer isn't simple, but it is scientific. It is biology. There is a theory about a boiling frog. If you drop a frog into a pot of boiling water, it will instinctively jump out to save its life. But if you put that same frog in a pot of tepid water and slowly, degree by degree, turn up the heat, the frog will stay. It will adjust its body temperature to match the water. It will expend all its energy trying to acclimatize rather than trying to escape. By the time the water is boiling, the frog is too exhausted to jump. It cooks to death, never realizing it was in danger until it was too late. That is exactly what happened to me. They didn't storm the castle with battering rams. They invaded by degrees. It started with the small things, the room temperature water. The first week, Susan moved my mother's crystal vase from the mantelpiece to the back of a cupboard. It clashed with the feng shui, she told me with a tight smile. I wanted to scream, but I looked at my father's anxious face and I swallowed my anger. I told myself it was just a vase. I told myself I was being flexible. I adjusted my temperature. Then came the parking spot. I had always parked in the garage, a necessity for loading my heavy design equipment. One evening I came home to find Susan's SUV occupying my bay. "Susan has bad knees," my father explained, looking at his shoes. "The walk from the driveway is too much for her." I knew Susan went to Zumba classes 3 times a week, but I didn't argue. I started parking in the street, hauling my drafting table through the rain. I told myself I was being considerate. The water got a little warmer. The heat turned up significantly when Kelsey, my 16-year-old stepsister, decided she needed a content creation space. I came home early one Tuesday to find my design studio, the sunroom my mother and I had tiled together, completely transformed. My drafting table was covered in makeup palettes and ring lights. My blueprints representing months of work were shoved into a pile on the floor. Kelsey was sitting in my ergonomic chair filming a TikTok. When I confronted her, she rolled her eyes. "God, Natalie, you're never even here. Why do you need all this space just to draw pictures of grass?" I waited for my father to step in. I waited for him to tell her that this was my office, my livelihood, my house. Instead, he suggested I move my workspace to the basement. "It's quieter down there, Nat," he said, "less distractions." That was the moment the water started to bubble. I wasn't just accommodating them anymore. I was being erased. I had normalized the disrespect so thoroughly that they didn't even see me as the owner anymore. I was just an appliance that hummed in the background, paying the electric bill so they could have better lighting for their selfies. I was the frog sitting in scalding water, telling myself it was just a warm bath, right up until the moment they tried to put the lid on the pot. The water finally boiled over because of rain. A massive storm rolled in off the coast, battering the old house for 3 days straight. On the second night, I woke up to the sound of dripping. The slate roof, original to the house and desperately in need of restoration, had finally given way. Water was pooling in the upstairs hallway, ruining the plaster ceiling and threatening the hardwood floors below. I panicked. I called 3 emergency roofers, but everyone was booked solid due to the storm. That's when my father stepped in. "I know a guy," he said, looking at the water damage with genuine concern. "Old friend from my contracting days. He specializes in slate. He can squeeze us in, but he needs a deposit up front to secure the materials." He quoted me $8,500. It was a huge sum, almost half of my liquid savings, but the house was bleeding. I didn't hesitate. I wrote the check directly to my father because he said he was handling the transaction to get the friend discount. I handed it to him with shaking hands. "Please," I said, "save the roof." He looked me in the eye, took the check and said, "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll take care of it." 3 days later, the rain stopped, but no roofer appeared. When I asked my father, he said there was a delay with the slate shipment. "Supply chain issues," he mumbled, avoiding my gaze. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. Then came Tuesday. I was at work scrolling through Instagram during my lunch break when a picture popped up on my feed. It was Kelsey. She was wearing a white bikini, holding a glass of champagne, leaning over a railing with the bright blue ocean behind her. The location tag read, Santorini, Greece. The caption read, "Surprise vacay, thanks daddy for making dreams come true, cruisin' blessed Euro trip." I froze. I swiped to the next photo. It was a selfie of Kelsey, Susan, and my father. They were all smiling, tanned, and clearly not in a hardware store buying slate. My father was wearing a linen shirt I'd never seen before, holding a cocktail. They weren't waiting for a roofer. They were on a luxury European cruise. I pulled up my banking app. The check for $8,500 had cleared 3 days ago. The payee wasn't a roofing company. It was cash. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. There was no roofer. There was no supply chain issue. There was just my father cashing my check to take his wife and stepdaughter on a vacation while water dripped into the hallway of the house he claimed to protect. They had stolen the roof over my head to pay for a view of the ocean. The house seemed to sense the violation. The air inside felt heavy, stagnant. I spent 2 days in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of work, but my mind was stuck on that photo of my father in Greece. Then on Thursday afternoon, the rumbling started. I was in my home office when the floorboards began to vibrate. A deep mechanical growl echoed from the backyard. I ran to the window. A massive yellow excavator was rolling across my lawn, its treads tearing up the grass my mother had meticulously seeded. Behind it, a pickup truck with Miller Construction stenciled on the door pulled to a stop. I sprinted outside. "Hey!" I shouted, waving my arms. A burly man in a hard hat climbed out of the truck. He looked at me then at a clipboard. "Work order for the greenhouse demo," he said, pointing a thumb at the delicate glass structure at the edge of the property. "Client wants it cleared for a lap pool. We're digging the foundation today." "What client?" I demanded, planting myself between the machine and the greenhouse. "Mrs. Susan Miller," he read. "And a Mr. Brian Miller. They scheduled this 3 weeks ago. Said they'd be out of town, told us to just get started." I felt dizzy. The greenhouse was my mother's sanctuary. It was where she taught me to propagate succulents, where she drank her morning tea. Susan wasn't just modernizing. She was erasing. She had scheduled the demolition while she was on vacation so she wouldn't have to hear the glass shatter. "Stop everything," I said, my voice shaking but loud. "They don't own this property. I do." The foreman, whose name tag read Frank, looked skeptical. "Look, lady, I got a signed contract and a deposit check." "The check will bounce," I said flatly. "Just like the one they wrote for the roof." Frank paused. He looked at the excavator, then back at me. He pulled out his phone. "Let me call the office." I waited, my heart hammering against my ribs. I watched him pace, speaking in low, angry tones. After 2 minutes, he hung up and walked back to me. His face was a mask of fury. "Check didn't clear," he growled. "Bank returned it this morning. Insufficient funds." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. "I'm sorry," I said. "My father, he's not honest." Frank spat on the ground. "Waste of my time, waste of my gas." He signaled to the excavator operator to kill the engine. The silence that followed was profound. "Wait," I said, a plan forming in my mind with sudden crystalline clarity. "Don't leave yet." I pulled the deed from my back pocket. I had started carrying a copy everywhere. I showed him my name. I showed him the date. "I'm the owner, and I have a job for you. Since you're already here with a crew and a truck." Frank raised an eyebrow. "What kind of job?" I looked toward the house at the master bedroom window where Susan's beige curtains hung. "I don't need a pool," I said. "I need eviction service. I need everything that isn't mine out of that house and into a dumpster. Today. I'll pay double your day rate, cash." Frank looked at the house. He looked at me. Then a slow, grim smile spread across his face. The sun was setting when the taxi pulled into the driveway. My father, Susan, and Kelsey piled out their skin golden from the Mediterranean sun, laughing about some inside joke. Their luggage was piled high on a cart the driver was unloading. It was a perfect picture of a happy family returning home. Until they saw the driveway. Their belongings, Susan's beige sofas, the massive TV, Kelsey's ring lights, my father's golf clubs, were neatly stacked in a massive orange dumpster sitting right in front of the garage. It looked like a modern art installation titled "The Consequence."